the day ownership lost its borders. For centuries, ownership was anchored to geography. Land belonged to nations. Assets lived inside borders. Rights were enforced by local laws and distant authorities. And then, almost without warning, ownership slipped free from the map. Today, value moves across the world in seconds, unconcerned with passports or permission. To understand why this moment matters, we have to revisit the shift that quietly dissolved the link between possession and place. Because when ownership went borderless, the balance of power began to change in ways most people still don't fully grasp. The old system was built on location. Property records sat in local offices. Stocks were tied to national exchanges. Wealth was constrained by jurisdiction, currency controls, and political boundaries. Crossing borders meant friction, fees, delays, risk. Ownership existed, but it was never fully yours unless institutions allowed it to be. The reveal began when blockchain introduced a different logic. Assets no longer needed to reside in a country. They could exist as cryptographic keys, secure by math instead of law. Whoever held the key controlled the asset. No registry required. No intermediary needed. Ownership became portable, absolute, and global by default. At first, this applied only to digital money, but the idea spread quickly. Tokens began representing art, identity, access, even fragments of real-world property. Suddenly, someone could own value recognized everywhere, yet registered nowhere. Borders still existed on maps, but they no longer defined who could hold what. This shift unlocked new freedom. People in unstable economies could protect savings beyond local collapse. Entrepreneurs could raise capital globally without gatekeepers. Communities could coordinate ownership without forming companies or crossing legal systems. Ownership stopped being granted. It started being claimed. But with that freedom came disruption. Governments struggled to tax what they could not locate. Courts struggled to enforce what they could not seize. Institutions built on jurisdiction watched their influence thin as value slipped through their fingers, unbound by geography. What changed wasn't just technology. It was a definition of ownership itself. Possession was no longer enforced by proximity. It was enforced by control. And control had become digital. The day ownership lost its borders, the world entered a new phase, one where power followed keys, not countries. As ownership became portable, its consequences spread far beyond finance. People began holding assets that no government could easily freeze, confiscate, or redefine. This was a rebellion in the traditional sense. It was a structural shift. Power moved quietly from institutions to individuals, not through protest, but through mathematics. The conflict emerged when states realized that borderless ownership undermined long-standing assumptions about authority. Taxes relied on location. Enforcement relied on jurisdiction. Control relied on intermediaries. But cryptographic ownership ignored all three. Assets could be transferred instantly across continents without permission, and once transferred, there was no central switch to reverse it. Governments responded unevenly. Some attempted restrictions, hoping to trap value within borders through regulation and reporting. Others adapted, redefining legal frameworks to accommodate a world where ownership no longer stayed put. A few leaned into competition, racing to become havens for digital capital. The global balance shifted as nations discovered that capital now chose destinations, not the other way around. Individuals felt the change personally. Ownership became a responsibility rather than a guarantee. Lose the key, lose the asset. No bank to call, no court to appeal to. Freedom came paired with risk, and many were unprepared for that trade-off. Yet for others, the clarity was empowering. What you controlled was truly yours, without fine print or silent restrictions. Meanwhile, institutions attempted to recreate borders digitally. Custodial services, wrapped assets, compliance layers designed to reintroduce familiar controls. These solutions offer convenience, but at a cost. They blurred the line between true ownership and permission access, reminding users that not all digital assets were equal. As tokens began representing real-world value, property rights, intellectual property, shares of infrastructure, the stakes rose sharply. Borderless ownership threatened to outpace legal systems designed for slower, localized worlds. Disputes emerged with no clear venue. Rights clashed across jurisdictions. The law lagged behind code, struggling to translate centuries-old concepts into a world where possession could change hands in seconds. The buildup intensified as one truth became impossible to ignore. Ownership without borders meant responsibility without refuge. Protection no longer came from geography. It came from knowledge, vigilance, and understanding the systems that enforce control invisibly. The world had not lost borders, but ownership no longer depended on them. And that distinction was quietly reshaping who held power and who was learning, sometimes painfully, what it meant to truly own something in a borderless age. As borderless ownership expanded, its darker edges began to surface. The same systems that empowered individuals also exposed them to risks no institution could soften. There were no national protections against mistakes, no universal standards for recovery, and no shared authority to resolve conflicts when ownership crossed legal worlds that could not speak the same language. The conflict deepened when disputes emerged that no court could fully address. A digital asset might represent real-world value in one country, yet be legally invisible in another. A key holder could exercise absolute control while remaining anonymous. Victims of fraud discovered that justice depended not on law, but on whether code allowed intervention. Ownership had become precise, but accountability had become fragmented. Institutions responded by tightening their grip where they could. Exchanges introduced compliance layers. Governments demanded reporting. Platforms built systems that mirrored traditional controls under digital names. These efforts created a split reality. One world offered true borderless ownership, raw and unforgiving. The other offered convenience wrapped in familiar protections, but with borders quietly reintroduced through terms and permissions. Individuals were forced to choose. Some embraced sovereignty fully, accepting responsibility as the price of freedom. Others preferred hybrid systems, trading absolute control for safety nets. The divide wasn't ideological. It was practical. Borderless ownership demanded literacy, discipline, and constant awareness, qualities not evenly distributed. As real-world assets continued moving on-chain, the pressure intensified. Entire communities organized around shared ownership without forming companies or registering entities. Property was fractioned, traded, and governed by people scattered across continents. The concept of a local owner began to dissolve. Stewardship replaced possession. Participation replaced title. Emotionally, the shift was destabilizing. Ownership had always implied protection by force of law. Now implied self-defense through knowledge. The freedom was real, but so was the vulnerability. Those who understood the systems flourished. Those who didn't learn harsh lessons quickly. The build-up reached a critical realization. Borderless ownership didn't eliminate power structures. It reorganized them. Power flowed to those who could navigate complexity, secure keys, and understand invisible rules written in code rather than statute. The question looming over the world was no longer whether ownership should have borders. It was whether people were prepared for ownership without them, and what kind of society emerges when control depends not on where you live, but on what you understand. The turning point came when society stopped treating borderless ownership as a novelty and started living with its consequences. The abstraction faded. The responsibility became real. People learned that freedom without intermediaries meant standing alone with their decisions, their mistakes, and their successes. The climax revealed a hard truth. Ownership without borders did not create equality. It created exposure. Those who understood the systems gained unprecedented control. Those who didn't were left vulnerable to errors that no authority could undo. The map had disappeared, but the terrain remained uneven. In the aftermath, a new balance began to form. Hybrid models emerged, blending self-custody with optional protections. Education became as valuable as capital. Communities formed around shared stewardship, teaching security, governance, and resilience. Ownership evolved from a static claim into an active practice, maintained through awareness rather than enforced by law. The resolution reshaped how value was understood. Owning something no longer meant relying on institutions to defend it. It meant understanding the rules that governed it. It meant accepting that control was absolute, but so was responsibility. Borders once offered protection through proximity. Now protection came from literacy and intent. This shift did not erase nations or laws. It redefined their reach. Governments adapted, institutions evolved, but the core change remained. Ownership had crossed a threshold it would never fully return from. Value had learned to move freely, and with it, power followed those who could navigate complexity rather than geography. What emerged was a quieter revolution, less visible than markets or politics, but far more enduring. A world where ownership was no longer granted by where you stood, but by what you could secure, understand, and sustain. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The day